By 9 tomorrow morning, this porch will be seized, boarded, and tagged as common property, Patricia Greer said, her manicured finger tapping the violation notice like she was stamping a verdict. Her voice carried the smugness of someone who thought she'd already won. The cedar planks beneath my boots creaked, but I didn't flinch. She stood there in her press suit, the kind of person who looked more comfortable behind a desk than by a lakeshore. But she loved moments like this. Public theater meant to humiliate. I leaned against the railing, eyes level with hers. "Funny thing," I said, quiet but sharp. "You're standing on my easement right now." Her expression cracked for the first time, a brief flicker of confusion crossing her face. I didn't explain. Not yet. I wanted her to feel the weight of that sentence, the way a storm cloud hangs before breaking. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. She straightened her shoulders quickly, masking her hesitation with a cold laugh. "Easement? Don't play games, Daniel. The board voted and the fines will keep piling until you fold." She was used to neighbors stammering apologies, not pushing back. But I wasn't just another neighbor. I was Daniel Mercer, licensed land surveyor, son of the man who mapped this entire lakefront before half these cabins even existed. I carried that knowledge in my bones, and every line of land I'd ever measured was etched into my memory like scripture. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I know every stake in this soil, Patricia, and I know where this porch stands, down to the inch." My calmness was deliberate. That's what unsettled her more than anger could. The smell of cedar hung in the air, sharp and resinous. My father's porch, hand-built in the summer of '72, had been his pride. Every nail, every beam had been set with his own hands. When he passed, this porch became more than wood and nails. It was a promise. I'd grown up on these steps, sitting beside him while he explained how boundaries weren't just lines on a map, but legacies to be honored. Losing this porch wouldn't just mean losing square footage. It would mean losing him all over again. That's why Patricia's notice hit harder than any stack of fines. She wasn't just threatening property. She was threatening memory. This porch was the place where my father sipped black coffee at dawn, where my Aunt Carol told stories about her childhood, where my daughter learned to balance her first fishing pole. Strangers might see it as planks on a foundation, but to me, it was the last living pulse of my family's history. Patricia turned, already calling to her relatives who lingered at the edge of the driveway. She wanted them to see her moment of triumph, to watch her knock another neighbor into submission. That's when I realized she hadn't come here to enforce rules. She'd come for a spectacle. She wanted me broken in front of witnesses. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that says, "You're not ready for what comes next." "Where are you watching from?" I asked, my voice steady. "Because from here, Patricia, this isn't your victory. It's the opening act." I didn't raise the survey maps yet. I didn't mention the county records. That would come later. For now, all she needed to know was that she'd chosen the wrong man, the wrong porch, and the wrong legacy to trample. She walked off the porch with a satisfied smirk, convinced she'd rattled me. But my pulse stayed calm, steady as the lake at midnight. Inside, though, the fire had already caught. Patricia thought tomorrow would end with me stripped of this cabin, humiliated in front of her cheering relatives. What she didn't know was that tomorrow would be the day her authority cracked in full view of everyone she'd dragged here to celebrate. And I was ready to make sure of it. Patricia's smirk lingered in my mind long after she left the porch. The sound of her heels crunching against the gravel driveway was like a gavel striking. She believed the matter was settled, that her notice was final. But as the evening shadows stretched over the lake, I couldn't shake the faces of my neighbors, families who'd been cornered the same way I was now. I thought of the quiet goodbyes, the for sale signs that popped up after months of harassment. Patricia had run this play before, and it worked because most people didn't know how to fight back. I wasn't most people. The next morning, I walked into the community clubhouse. It was supposed to be neutral ground, but Patricia had claimed it long ago, decorating it with photographs of approved gatherings. Neat lawns, identical siding, everything whitewashed to match her vision. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, sharp and artificial. A handful of board members sat in a semicircle, papers stacked neatly in front of them. Patricia presided like a queen on her throne, tapping a pen against her binder as neighbors filtered in. I leaned against the back wall, listening. A man named George was called forward first. His crime? Planting a maple tree without prior approval. $50 a day until it came down, Patricia declared, her voice clipped. He tried to argue that the tree was a gift from his granddaughter, but Patricia cut him off, snapping that sentiment isn't in the bylaws. George's shoulders sagged as he nodded, beaten before the fight even began. The room was silent, except for Patricia's voice and the scratching of her pen. Then came a young couple, the Fergusons. They'd painted their shutters a shade darker than the regulation palette, $100 a day. The wife bit her lip, her hands twisting in her lap. No one in the room looked her in the eye. Everyone knew it could be them next. I'd seen this pattern too, many times. Patricia thrived on fear, on the silence that followed her rulings. She didn't just enforce the rules, she weaponized them. And here, in the fluorescent-lit sterility of the clubhouse, the weight of her control pressed down like humidity before a storm. But I also noticed something else. The way eyes darted to me in the back. Not openly, not yet. But there was a flicker of hope, as if they knew I might not roll over like the rest. When my name was called, Patricia's smile widened. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her tone deliberately slow, savoring the words. "Your violation is no small matter. This encroachment undermines the very structure of our community's shared property rights." She slid the violation notice across the table, as if she were presenting evidence at trial. Her relatives weren't here this time, but her board members leaned in, watching, waiting for me to crack. I didn't pick up the paper. "Interesting," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Because as a licensed surveyor, I've measured land disputes bigger than this community, and I can tell you, those stakes you're so proud of don't line up." The room shifted, an almost imperceptible ripple of unease moving across the board members. Patricia's jaw tightened, but she hid it with a quick laugh. "Big claims, Daniel, but this isn't about your resume. This is about compliance." She dismissed me with a flick of her hand, turning to the next agenda item, as though I were already defeated. But I noticed Tom Alvarez, sitting 2 seats down from her. He didn't laugh. His eyes narrowed, his pen hovering over his paper, without moving. A crack in the wall, small but real. Neighbors filed out quietly after the meeting ended. George caught my arm on the way out. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of losing. "If anyone can beat her," he murmured, "it's you." Then he was gone, leaving me with the weight of expectation I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Outside, the evening air was cool, laced with the scent of pine and lake water. I stood on the steps, watching Patricia's car pull out of the lot. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. She thought this was just another neighbor ground down, another family that would eventually give up. But I wasn't giving up, not with my father's porch on the line, not with an entire neighborhood watching, waiting to see if someone, anyone, could prove she wasn't untouchable. The clubhouse door shut behind me with a heavy thud, but the image of Patricia's satisfied smirk lingered, burned into my mind. I walked toward the gravel lot, the cool air carrying the faint tang of pine and lake water. Cars pulled out one by one, headlights flashing as families drove home in silence. Most left with their shoulders hunched, heads lowered, as though the weight of her rulings had already sunk into their bones. But one figure remained, Tom Alvarez. He lingered near his sedan, papers tucked under his arm, staring at the ground like it held answers. He wasn't talking to anyone, and that alone said plenty. Most board members clustered together after meetings, reassuring each other with forced confidence. Not Tom. He stood apart, caught between shadows and headlights. I slowed as I passed. He glanced up quickly, then away, as though afraid to be caught meeting my eyes. His jaw tightened. His foot tapped against the gravel, uneven and restless. A man rehearsing an argument with himself. "You've got questions," I said, keeping my tone steady. Not accusing, not friendly, just steady. His shoulders jerked slightly, a reflex he tried to mask by adjusting his papers. "Just long day," he muttered, though his voice cracked at the end. He didn't leave. He didn't move closer either, just hovered in that no-man's land of hesitation. Tom wasn't like Patricia. He didn't radiate smugness or certainty. He radiated conflict. His eyes flicked toward the clubhouse doors, then back to me, then down again. His fingers drummed against the folder he carried, faster now. That was the tell. I'd spent a lifetime reading body language in land disputes, watching angry clients or nervous property owners. Tom's body betrayed him. He was caught in the middle, drowning in silence. "You know this isn't right," I said quietly. "You saw her tonight. You've seen her before." He swallowed hard, throat bobbing. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, like standing still was suddenly unbearable. His car keys clinked in his hand, a nervous tick. His mouth opened, then shut again. The words were there, pressing against his lips, but he couldn't let them out. Not yet. I didn't push. The silence itself was telling. Instead, I leaned back against the hood of my truck, arms folded, and let the night fill the gap. The lake was calm, reflecting the last streaks of twilight. Crickets buzzed in the brush, and Tom kept staring at his shoes, his entire body angled away, but his feet still pointed toward me. A subconscious betrayal of his own indecision. When he finally spoke, it wasn't much. "Patricia, she thinks she's protecting property values." The words stumbled out, weak, unconvincing even to him. His shoulders slumped as soon as he said it, like he already regretted trying to defend her. "Or protecting herself," I said. "The fines, the seizures, they're not about values, they're about control." His fingers gripped the folder so tight I thought it might tear. He glanced up again, and for half a second our eyes met. What I saw wasn't loyalty. It was guilt. Heavy, suffocating guilt. He shook his head suddenly, like snapping himself awake. "I should go," he muttered, fumbling with his car keys. But even as he moved toward his car, his steps faltered. He lingered, door open, one hand on the frame. A man wanting to drive away but chained to something. Heavier. I didn't stop him. Not yet. He needed space to wrestle with his conscience, to realize on his own what side he was standing on. Still, I knew this much. Tom Alvarez wasn't Patricia. He wasn't comfortable with her games, with turning families into targets, and sooner or later, that guilt would demand a voice. As his taillights disappeared down the road, I stood alone in the lot, the weight of expectation pressing in from all sides. Patricia thought she'd orchestrated the perfect humiliation. But cracks were already forming, quiet ones, hidden in restless feet and nervous hands. And I'd learned to read cracks like a map. Tomorrow, I told myself, those cracks would widen. The gravel lot was empty now, the glow of Tom's taillights swallowed by the trees. I stayed there for a while, listening to the crickets, feeling the night press in. Tomorrow would bring more, I knew. Patricia never left things half done. If she thought she'd rattled me with that violation notice, she was about to double down. That was her way, pressure until people cracked. By morning, the next round arrived in my mailbox. Thick envelopes stamped with the HOA crest, stacked so high they barely fit. I carried them inside, dropped them on the kitchen table, and the sound echoed through the cabin like a hammer strike. Each envelope was another fine, another day Patricia claimed I was trespassing on land that wasn't mine. The pile looked less like paperwork and more like a burial mound, an attempt to smother me under official language and arbitrary numbers. I slit one open. Failure to comply will result in daily penalties of $200, effective immediately. Another, board reserves right to seize disputed structure. Another, legal action pending. Patricia's handwriting, neat and deliberate, scrawled across the bottom of one. "This will not end well for you." I sat at the table, the cedar wood beneath my fingers smooth and familiar. My father had sanded it himself, years ago, when this cabin was his refuge from a world that never gave him peace. Now that same wood held her threats. I could almost hear him in my head. "Don't let them take it, son. Not without a fight." Outside, the lake shimmered in the early light. A loon called across the water, long and low, and I steadied myself. Patricia thought she was building momentum, tightening the noose. What she didn't know was that every letter she sent became another brick in her own wall of overreach. HOAs had rules, yes, but those rules had limits. And Patricia's pile of fines was starting to look less like authority and more like harassment. The phone rang, sharp and sudden. It was Aunt Carol. Her voice trembled with anger. "She invited her family, Daniel. Said they could come down this weekend to watch, like it's some show. I closed my eyes, gripping the receiver tighter. Of course Patricia would do that. Turn it into theater, drag her relatives here to clap when she declared victory. She wasn't just after my porch, she wanted to make me an example, to scare the rest of the neighborhood into silence. Let her bring them, I said finally. My voice surprised even me, steady, almost calm. They'll see what happens when you push too far. After the call, I spread the notices across the table, a paper mosaic of threats. Each one smelled faintly of toner and ink, sterile and impersonal, but together they carried Patricia's signature cruelty. I picked them up, stacked them neatly, and slid them into a folder. Evidence. That's what they'd be, sooner or later. As the morning stretched on, neighbors drifted past on their way to errands or fishing trips. Some glanced toward my cabin, eyes sympathetic but wary. They'd seen the mail truck stop. They knew what was inside. One or two gave me nods, subtle acknowledgments that said, "We know what you're facing. We just can't say it out loud." I stood by the window, watching Patricia's silver SUV roll slowly down the road later that afternoon. She didn't stop, she didn't wave, but her window slid down just enough for her to toss a glance my way. One of those cold stares that says, "You're already finished." I didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there with my arms crossed, letting her look, letting her see that the porch was still there, solid as ever. When her SUV disappeared over the hill, I turned back to the folder on my table. The fines, the notices, the threats, they weren't breaking me, they were building my case. Patricia thought escalation would corner me, but she was only proving what I already knew. She was overstepping, and sooner or later, someone other than me would see it. The kitchen grew quiet again, sunlight filtering through the blinds in thin golden lines. I sat back down, hands pressed to the cedar surface, and felt my father's presence steady me. Patricia wanted me to fold. Instead, she'd given me the fuel to fight. The folder of fines sat on the kitchen table like a coiled snake, but I knew staring at it wouldn't change a thing. What would change everything was outside, on the land itself. Patricia's threats depended on those crooked boundary stakes she'd planted like they were gospel. But I'd been raised with a compass in my hand, taught by a man who believed in precision. My father used to say, "Lines tell the truth, son, if you know how to read them." That voice pulled me out the door and down toward the porch. The morning was cool, the air carrying the damp weight of lake mist. I grabbed my field pack, compass, tripod, GPS unit, and measuring tape, gear I hadn't expected to use for personal reasons. My boots crunched on gravel as I walked past the cedar porch and onto the slope that edged toward the waterline. The stakes Patricia's board had driven into the ground leaned slightly, uneven, like afterthoughts hammered by someone who cared more about optics than accuracy. I knelt, ran my hand along the weathered wood of one stake. It was painted bright red, meant to scream authority, but up close it was sloppy, off-center, carelessly sunk. My father would have laughed at the arrogance of it. I set up my tripod, adjusted the level, and sighted along the line. The beam cut through air and landed nowhere near the coordinates burned into my memory from years of surveying. I started walking the perimeter, measuring distances, recalculating in my head. Every step made it clearer. Patricia's common property line didn't match the deed. The numbers didn't lie. My porch wasn't intruding on their land. It was sitting exactly where my father had left it, inside our boundary, anchored in legitimacy. Patricia's claim was built on bad math and arrogance. The soil was soft under my boots as I pushed deeper into the tree line, measuring angles, noting distances. The lake glimmered through the birches, a reminder that this land wasn't just coordinates. It was memory. Each measurement I took reinforced that memory with cold precision. By the time I circled back, sweat dampened my shirt, but the knot in my chest had loosened. I had what I needed, the beginning of proof. Still, proof had to be more than numbers scribbled in my notebook. Patricia wouldn't back down just because I had expertise. She thrived on dismissing people's knowledge. But if I aligned what I measured with official plats at the county office, her whole argument would unravel. I packed my gear, the metallic snap of the tripod echoing like punctuation. The cedar porch waited for me at the top of the slope, glowing golden in the sun. I rested my hand on the railing. "You're safe," I muttered under my breath, as if my father might still be listening. Back inside, I spread my notebook on the table and lined up the numbers. Angles, bearings, distances. It all sang the same tune. Patricia's markers were frauds. She either didn't understand land surveys or she didn't care. Both worked in my favor. I imagined her face when she realized the error wasn't mine. It was hers. That flicker of confusion I'd seen when I first mentioned easements would return. Only this time, it would happen in front of her entire audience. The phone buzzed. A message from George, the neighbor with the maple tree fine. Heard she's calling for a seizure vote next week. "Hang in there, Dan." Even in his beaten-down tone, there was a sliver of faith. People were watching. People were waiting for someone to break the pattern. I slid the folder of fines aside and replaced it with my notebook. The pages were smudged with dirt and sweat, but they were cleaner than anything Patricia could throw at me. Tomorrow, I'd take this to the county, match it against their official plats, and start building the trap. Patricia wanted to bury me in rules, but she'd forgotten that rules cut both ways. The sun dropped lower, washing the lake in firelight. I closed the notebook, the porch, creaking under my weight as I stepped outside one more time. The water was calm, but beneath it, currents ran strong, same as here. On the surface, Patricia thought she was in control. Underneath, the tide had already turned. The lake still glowed with firelight when I stepped back inside, notebook under my arm. But the peace of evening didn't last. By dawn the next day, a new envelope was wedged into my mailbox, thicker, heavier. I carried it down the lakeshore path before opening it, my boots brushing against dew-soaked grass. The sun was just rising, streaks of orange spilling across the water. I tore it open, and Patricia's words hit like a slap. Final warning. Non-compliance will result in seizure of structure and removal of disputed elements within 7 days. She'd underlined final warning twice, as if repetition could transform fiction into law. My hands tightened on the paper until the edges crumpled. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a countdown. Patricia had set the clock ticking, daring me to act before the week ended. If I did nothing, she'd march onto my land, with her relatives cheering behind her, strip away my father's porch, and call it victory. The breeze carried the smell of wet earth and pine as I crouched by the crooked boundary stake near the path. I pressed the letter against it, watching the sun burn through Patricia's ink like a spotlight exposing lies. I didn't need anger now. What I needed was certainty, the kind that came not from gut feelings, but from records that couldn't be argued away. I headed into town, the dirt road winding between cabins and docks, until the trees broke open into asphalt and storefronts. The county office stood 2 blocks from the courthouse, a squat brick building with a flag rippling out front. The inside smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax, the kind of place where time moves slowly, but records lasted forever. At the clerk's counter, I gave my name and parcel number. The clerk, a gray-haired woman with reading glasses perched low on her nose, disappeared into the back. Minutes later, she returned with a rolled-up plat map and a stamped copy of my deed. The weight of it in my hand steadied me more than anything had in days. I unrolled the plat across a side table, smoothing the creases. My measurements from yesterday matched almost exactly with the county's records. Bearings aligned, distances confirmed. Patricia's stakes weren't just a little off. They were inside my deeded property, an encroachment of their own. The irony almost made me laugh. She wasn't protecting common ground. She was trespassing. I traced the survey line with my finger, the ink faded but clear. My father had signed on these very plats when he purchased the land. His name was still there, written decades ago in bold pen strokes. For a moment, I felt him beside me, steady, certain, telling me the truth was all I needed. The clerk stamped the copy from my records. "Keep this safe," she said, sliding it across the counter. Her tone was casual, but the gravity in those 4 words felt like a benediction. I folded the document carefully and tucked it into my pack, the paper crisp against my palm. Back outside, the sky had turned a sharp blue, the kind that made every line on the horizon seem more defined. The countdown Patricia had set didn't rattle me anymore. She could threaten, fine, even parade her relatives all she wanted. But I had more than defiance now. I had the county's ink, the state's authority, and a record stronger than any notice she could shove in my mailbox. Walking back along the lakeshore path, I stopped at the porch again. The cedar boards were warm under the afternoon sun, the grain glowing like amber. This wasn't just a structure. It was my father's last word, written in wood instead of ink. And now I had proof it was untouchable. Patricia thought she'd cornered me with her deadline, but what she really did was force me to lock in my defense. The clock was still ticking, yes, but it wasn't counting down to my loss. It was counting down to her exposure. The cedar boards still glowed beneath the late sun when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I looked up to see a faded blue sedan easing to a stop near the edge of my driveway. Tom Alvarez stepped out, his tie loosened, jacket tossed across the passenger seat. He looked around as if making sure no one had followed him. His movements carried that same hesitation I'd noticed outside the clubhouse, the restless shifting, the way his hand lingered on the car door like he wasn't sure he should close it. "Evening," I said, not moving from the porch. He gave a short nod, eyes darting to the lake, then to the porch, and finally back to me. "Mind if we talk, away from people?" I motioned toward the path that curved around the cabin and down to the dock. The boards creaked as we walked, gulls crying overhead, the water slapping softly against the shore. Out here, the world felt quieter, though Tom's tension filled the air. He stopped at the end of the dock, hands shoved deep in his pockets. His gaze stayed fixed on the rippling water. "I shouldn't be here," he muttered. "Patricia, if she finds out?" His voice trailed off, the weight of his fear pulling it down. "You came anyway," I said. "That tells me something." His jaw worked as though he were grinding words between his teeth before spitting them out. Finally, he pulled a folded paper from his pocket and slapped it lightly against his palm. "She never verified with the county. That's what's been eating at me. She had the board vote on the seizure without any outside confirmation. No plats, no surveyor's check, nothing. Just her markers and her word." I didn't move. I let the words hang there, the wind tugging at the edges of the dock. "She told us it was airtight," he continued, voice low and hurried now, as if spilling it fast made it less dangerous. "Said the boundaries were obvious, said going to the county was a waste of time. I wanted to believe her. Hell, I almost did. But then I saw your face that night at the meeting. You weren't bluffing. You knew those lines didn't add up." He finally looked at me, and the guilt in his eyes was unmistakable. His shoulders hunched forward, his whole frame pulled inward like he wanted to disappear. "I should have spoken up then. I didn't. I let her push it through." I took a slow breath. His confession wasn't just information, it was validation. Patricia hadn't just been careless. She'd cut corners, bypassing the very checks that gave her claims legitimacy. If the county records backed me, Tom's words would nail her coffin shut. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. His foot tapped against the dock, rapid, uneven. "Because she's planning to make a show out of it. Saturday morning. She's got her relatives coming, neighbors too. Says she's going to prove once and for all that no one can stand against her. And if I sit through that meeting knowing the truth..." He shook his head, swallowed hard. "I can't. Not anymore." The folded paper trembled in his hand before he pressed it into mine. "It's just notes from the board meeting, but you'll see. No county documentation, no external survey. Nothing. If this blows up, she'll throw us all under the bus. But it's her signature on those orders, not mine." The paper felt heavier than it should have, like a brick laid neatly into the foundation of my case. I slid it carefully into my jacket pocket. He backed away, already glancing toward his car. "Don't tell anyone I came," he said. His voice cracked again, but this time there was relief in it too, like unloading a burden that had been choking him for weeks. "Just do something with it." He hurried up the path, his figure shrinking into the dusk. I stayed on the dock, the waves lapping steady, my hand resting on the pocket where his confession sat. Patricia's deadline was coming fast, but now I had more than numbers. I had proof she'd skipped the very steps that would have made her case legitimate. The tide had turned, and this time, she wouldn't see it coming. I stood on the dock long after Tom's car disappeared down the road, the folded notes heavy in my pocket. The lake was calm, but inside me everything surged. Patricia had crossed a line, and now I had more than suspicion. I had confirmation from someone inside her circle. I'd spent my life working with lines, boundaries, and proof. And this time, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting to show everyone that her power was built on sand. The next morning, I drove back into town, the road winding through birch trees before spilling into the courthouse square. My destination was the county surveyor's office, a building I knew well. Its walls were lined with maps, the kind that told stories in angles and bearings instead of words. Inside, the smell of ink and paper filled the air, grounding me. The county surveyor, a stocky man named Hal, greeted me with a raised eyebrow. "Back again, Mercer? Didn't think I'd see you unless it was for work." "This is work," I said, laying my measurements and Tom's notes on the counter. "Just not the kind I usually bill for." Hal studied the figures, adjusted his glasses, and whistled softly. "These HOA stakes are miles off. Looks like whoever set them didn't bother with alignment." I pulled the stamped plat map from my folder and set it beside my notes. "Patricia Greer claims my porch sits on common property. She's wrong, but she's planning a seizure in front of half the neighborhood, and I need this settled before then." Hal tapped the plat with his pen, then looked me square in the eye. "You know this already. What you need is certification, something no board can argue with." That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Together, we ran through the official records point by point. My field notes matched his county data. Bearings were consistent. Boundaries were clean. There was no ambiguity. The porch sat fully inside my deeded land. Patricia hadn't just skipped verification. She'd built her case on fiction. Hale stamped the documents with the county seal, the sound echoing through the quiet office like a hammer striking iron. He slid them across the counter. "You'll want these notarized. Once you present them, there's nothing she can do, unless she wants to challenge the county itself." I folded the papers carefully, tucking them into the same folder that held Patricia's stack of fines. One was built on intimidation. The other was built on law. Only one would stand. As I left the office, I thought about Tom, his guilt, his confession, the way his hands shook as he handed me the notes. He wasn't just protecting me, he was protecting himself, and maybe even the community. If Patricia fell, he didn't want to be tied to her collapse. And now, thanks to him, I had the missing link. Proof she'd ignored proper procedure. Back at the cabin, I spread the documents across the cedar porch like a battle map. My father's porch. His handwriting still lived on the deed, ink fading but permanent. I traced the line of his name with my finger, then looked out at the lake. This wasn't just about me. It was about every family Patricia had bullied into silence. I imagined Saturday morning, Patricia standing tall, her relatives smirking, neighbors watching in dread. She'd raise her voice, declare my cabin in violation, wave her notices like scripture. But then I'd rise, slow and steady, and lay down the county's certification in front of everyone. The board would see, the neighbors would see, her relatives would see, and Patricia's authority would crack wide open. The thought steadied me. For the first time since this began, I wasn't just defending, I was preparing to win. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I slid the documents back into their folder, the edges sharp against my palm. Patricia had wanted a spectacle, a public humiliation. She'd get one, but not the way she imagined. The folder sat on my porch table like a loaded weapon, its contents sharper than any blade Patricia could swing. But documents alone weren't enough. Patricia thrived on spectacle, and I knew she'd try to twist even cold facts into theater. To win this, I needed more than paper. I needed voices, people willing to stand beside me when she called her audience. That thought carried me down the road to George's cabin. His maple tree still stood tall in the front yard, its leaves turning gold with the season. He'd been fined for it, beaten down, and yet the tree remained. A quiet act of defiance. When he opened the door, surprise flickered in his eyes, followed quickly by caution. "She's coming for me Saturday," I said plainly. "But she's wrong. I've got proof. What I need now are neighbors who'll stand as witnesses." George's hand tightened on the doorknob. His gaze drifted to the tree, then back to me. For a moment, I thought he'd close the door. Instead, he sighed and stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, his living room smelled faintly of wood smoke. We sat across from each other, the maple tree visible through the window like a silent participant. I laid the folder on the coffee table, opening it just enough for him to see the county seal on the survey. His eyes widened. "She never went to the county?" he asked. Number Tom Alvarez confirmed it. "These records show my porch is squarely inside my deeded land. Her whole case falls apart." For the first time, George smiled. Not wide, but enough to show what hope looked like when it returned after years of being buried. "Then I'll be there," he said firmly. "If you're standing up to her, I won't let you do it alone." One voice. It was a start. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving from house to house, each conversation a variation of the same rhythm. Hesitation, fear, then slow agreement as I showed them the folder and explained the truth. Some neighbors agreed instantly, anger bubbling over from years of fines and threats. Others wavered, caught between fear of retaliation and the promise of justice. By sunset, I had more than a handful of quiet pledges. Patricia wanted her relatives to see me humiliated, but she'd find neighbors instead, people tired of her rule, people ready to watch her authority collapse. My last stop was Aunt Carol's place. Her cabin sat at the far end of the road, perched above the water with wind chimes that sang in the breeze. She opened the door before I even knocked, worry already etched into her face. "She sent more letters today," Aunt Carol said, motioning to a stack on her kitchen counter. "Fines for the flower beds, fines for the mailbox paint. She's unraveling." "She's overreaching," I corrected. "And Saturday, it ends." I spread the documents across her kitchen table. She traced my father's name on the plat, her fingers trembling slightly. Tears welled in her eyes. "Your dad would be proud," she whispered. I sat beside her, letting the moment sink in. This wasn't just a fight with an HOA president. This was about a promise to family, about preserving something no stack of fines could erase. When I left, the stars were coming out, scattered across the lake's reflection. My folder was thicker now, not just with documents, but with testimonies, quiet voices ready to speak when the moment came. Patricia thought she'd choreographed a show of dominance, but I was building something stronger. As I walked back up to my porch, the cedar railing cool under my hand, I looked out across the water. Saturday was coming fast. Patricia believed she'd orchestrated my defeat. What she didn't realize was that I'd turned her stage into mine. The stars still shimmered on the water when I finally stepped inside, the folder tucked under my arm. Sleep didn't come easily that night, not with Saturday looming. By morning, the road through the neighborhood buzzed with unusual energy. Trucks idled in driveways, relatives from out of town pulling in with coolers and folding chairs. Patricia wanted a crowd for her spectacle, and she was going to get one. I watched from the window as her silver SUV cruised past, followed by 2 other cars. Her relatives stepped out laughing, carrying thermoses, acting as if they'd arrived for a parade. My neighbors, though, weren't laughing. They stood at their fences or on porches, quiet, wary, their eyes flicking toward me. Some gave me small nods. They knew Saturday wasn't just another enforcement. It was a showdown. I gathered my folder, slid the notarized county certification on top, and double-checked that Tom's notes were still inside. Every page mattered. I slipped the stack into a leather case, snapped it shut, and set it by the door. The weight of it wasn't just paper. It was leverage, the kind Patricia couldn't laugh away. By late afternoon, I walked the lakeshore path toward the open common area where Patricia had staged her gathering. The sound of chatter and clinking cups drifted across the water before I saw the crowd. Folding chairs lined the grass, Patricia's relatives already seated like an eager audience. She stood near the front, binder in hand, smiling as if she were about to announce a holiday. I stayed at the edge for a moment, unseen, scanning the faces. George sat on the left, arms crossed, his maple tree defiance written in his expression. A few others I'd spoken to over the past days were there too, standing with quiet strength. And then my gaze landed on Tom. He stood near the back, not seated, not relaxed. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. But when he saw me, he gave the smallest of nods. It was enough. Patricia cleared her throat, calling for attention. Her voice carried over the crowd, polished and commanding. "Neighbors, family, and friends, thank you for being here today. This community is built on order, fairness, and shared responsibility. But, as you all know, one cabin has defied that responsibility." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Her relatives leaned forward, hungry for the scene she'd promised them. I stepped into the open then, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, my case in hand. Patricia's smile faltered, but only for a second. "Daniel," she said, her tone dripping false sweetness. "Glad you decided to join us. You'll want to hear this." I didn't sit. I stood tall, just inside the circle of chairs, my eyes steady on hers. The leather case hung at my side like a promise. She launched into her performance, flipping open her binder. Pages of fines, violation notices, official stamps, all for show. "This structure," she declared, pointing toward my cabin's porch in the distance, "sits illegally on common property. The board has voted, and enforcement begins at week's end. Non-compliance will no longer be tolerated." Her relatives nodded, whispering, some smirking in my direction. But the neighbors? Their faces stayed still, waiting, watching. I waited until she finished her speech, until the silence stretched and everyone expected me to break. Then I stepped forward, placing the case gently on the folding table in front of her. The snap of the clasp opening echoed louder than her entire speech. I didn't speak yet. I let the pause linger, let every eye in the crowd fix on the case. Patricia shifted, her binder lowering slightly. That flicker of doubt in her eyes, it was back. Saturday wasn't just hers anymore. The stage she built was mine now, and I was ready to deliver what she feared most, truth in front of everyone she had dragged here to witness my defeat. The click of the clasp still echoed when I pulled the folder free, laying the county-stamped documents across the table. For a moment, no one moved. The crowd leaned forward, the air charged with the tension of a courtroom. Patricia's relatives craned their necks, smirks frozen in place, as though they weren't sure whether to laugh yet. My neighbors held their breath, waiting for the blow they'd been told was inevitable. Patricia broke the silence first, her voice dripping with impatience. "More stalling, Daniel? You can wave papers around all you want. The board already voted. This is settled." I lifted the top sheet and turned it outward. The golden seal of the county surveyor caught the light, glinting under the fading sun. My voice carried, calm and deliberate. "This is a certified survey from the county. It confirms the exact boundaries of my deeded property. That porch, my father's porch, sits fully within my land, every inch of it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Heads swiveled. People shifted in their chairs. George leaned forward, eyes wide, almost smiling. Tom Alvarez stood at the back, arms crossed now, his nervous energy replaced by something closer to resolve. Patricia laughed, sharp and brittle. "Certification? Don't be ridiculous. If that were true, why would the board—" "Because you never verified with the county," I cut in, my words landing hard. I reached into the folder again and lifted Tom's folded notes, holding them high enough for the first rows to see. "You pushed a vote without proper checks. No external survey, no county confirmation. Just your stakes and your word." Her cheeks flushed, the first crack in her armor. "That's hearsay. You expect anyone to believe." Tom's voice cut through from the back. "It's not hearsay." Every head turned. He stepped forward slowly, his hands no longer trembling. "I was there. I sat in that meeting. Patricia told us the boundaries were obvious and that going to the county was a waste of time. She skipped the process entirely." The gasp from the crowd was audible, like air sucked from a room. Patricia spun toward him, her expression shifting from control to fury. "Tom," she hissed, "be careful." But it was too late. He had crossed the line, and the relief in his face told me he wasn't stepping back. "You lied to us," Tom said, louder now, voice clear and steady. "You wanted a show, not fairness. You've been using fines and threats to scare families. I can't keep silent anymore." The neighbors erupted in murmurs, some angry, some relieved, many nodding in agreement. George stood, his voice carrying. "I've been fined hundreds for planting a tree my granddaughter gave me. You said it was against the bylaws, but if you'll skip the county on something this serious, why should we trust anything you've ever fined us for?" Others chimed in, voices overlapping, the dam of silence finally breaking. Patricia's relatives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their earlier smirks erased. This wasn't the humiliation they'd been promised. It was her undoing. Patricia slammed her binder shut, her voice straining to regain control. "This is all irrelevant. The board's decision stands. This man is just twisting facts to protect himself. I stepped closer, placing the notarized certification directly in front of her. These aren't my facts, Patricia. These are the county's. This document invalidates your vote, your fines, your entire case, and everyone here has seen it with their own eyes. The crowd grew louder, frustration boiling into demands. "Rescind the fines!" someone shouted. "Step down!" another called. Tom stood taller now, no longer hiding. "She doesn't speak for us anymore," he said firmly. Patricia's hands trembled against her binder. For the first time, she had no script, no smug retort. She looked out at the faces around her, neighbors she once cowed, into silence, relatives who now stared at her with embarrassment, and the weight of exposure settled on her shoulders. I didn't need to say more. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. The sun dipped behind the tree line, shadows stretching long across the grass. The crowd didn't disperse. They lingered, voices rising, energy shifting. This wasn't just about my porch anymore. It was about the entire community. A line drawn not on maps, but in hearts. Patricia's spectacle had become her collapse, and everyone was there to witness it. The crowd didn't disperse. They stayed gathered in the fading light, buzzing with the kind of energy you only feel after something historic cracks open in front of you. Patricia clutched her binder like a shield, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for support that wasn't there anymore. Even her relatives, who had arrived grinning with the expectation of spectacle, avoided her gaze now. The smug smiles were gone, replaced by discomfort and the realization they'd been dragged into a losing battle. Tom stood straighter than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders squared, his voice carrying above the murmurs. "This isn't leadership," he said. "This is abuse of power. We need a board that follows the law, not one that twists it for personal gain." His words hit harder than mine ever could, because they came from the inside, from one of Patricia's own. Patricia tried to interrupt, but her voice broke against the noise of the crowd. George shouted something about the tree fines. A woman across the circle demanded her mailbox penalties be reversed. One by one, neighbors found their voices, all speaking over her until she was drowned out completely. I stood quietly through it all, the folder closed in my hands, the seal of the county glinting in the dying sun. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to twist the knife. The evidence had already gutted her authority, and the community's anger was finishing what I had started. Finally, Patricia's voice cracked out, raw and small. "Enough!" But there was no weight left behind it. Her relatives shifted uneasily in their chairs, some rising as though to leave. Her face flushed crimson, and for the first time since this war began, I saw it. Fear. I stepped forward, speaking not to her, but to the neighbors. "The county has confirmed it. The porch is mine, by law. Every fine, every notice she's sent me collapses under this seal." I raised the folder just high enough for all to see. This fight was never just about me. It was about whether one person can twist rules and crush families under their thumb. Tonight, you all saw the truth for yourselves. The neighbors nodded, some clapping, others just standing taller, as though a weight had finally lifted. The sound of approval rolled through the crowd, not for me personally, but for the idea that someone had finally drawn the line. Patricia's binder slipped from her hands, papers spilling across the grass. She bent to gather them, but no one moved to help. Not her relatives, not the board, not a single neighbor. She was alone, and she knew it. Her shoulders sagged as she stuffed the scattered pages back into the binder, her earlier confidence completely erased. When she turned to leave, she didn't look at anyone. Head down, heels crunching against gravel as her relatives followed silently. I stayed behind with the others. George clapped me on the shoulder, his grip firm. "You did it," he said, voice low but filled with pride. Others gathered close, not to cheer but to thank, to share stories of their own fines and harassment. One by one, people spoke, and I realized this wasn't just resolution. It was beginning. Later, when the last of the crowd drifted home and the night turned still again, I sat on the cedar porch with Aunt Carol. The boards creaked softly under our weight, carrying the memory of my father like they always had. I traced the grain with my fingertips, feeling the smoothness he'd sanded decades ago. This porch had survived storms, seasons, and now Patricia Greer's arrogance. Aunt Carol rested her hand over mine. Your dad would have been proud, she said, her voice steady. I looked out over the lake, the moonlight shimmering across the surface. This place isn't going anywhere, I whispered. Not now, not ever. The silence stretched, comfortable and full. The battle was over. The legacy remained. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.